Welcome to the 17th episode of the World Builder's Anvil. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. This is your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic is, what is the state of your nation? Or nations, I guess it depends on how many you have in your world. And what we're going to talk about in today's show is, what are states? And one of the important things to think about with states are, I don't mean states as in the U.S., I'm talking more about nation states. However, nation states aren't always really nation states. If you go back to the Middle Ages and earlier, it was really a dynasty that could rule a country. And then they might end up ruling a different country at some point, and their allegiance would shift completely. The state was really only a nice thing, a nice structure set up for them that they would take advantage of. However, today they've grown into what we think of as nation states, which are like the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, many different places across the world, in the West and the East. And sometimes we overthink what nation states are. Some places might not really even be a nation state. They might have a government. However, the question is, do they exert the control needed to be a nation state? But really, you need to understand the basics of the nation state that you're operating in for your stories. First thing I like to look at is the cultural makeup. And I talked a little bit about cultures before. And the way I tie them into a nation is sort of like ethnicity breakdown. So my country might be 95% Badrakum and 4% Syrian and 1% Shiftarian. That might be a breakdown of a nation in my world. So one of the cultures is going to have a huge influence, but the other cultures that are there, even if they are considered second-class citizens, are going to impact that country and the mechanics of how it works. What is the form of government? And this isn't really talking about, are they free or are they not free? Are they democracy? The question is, how are they ruled? And there's a label to it, like the people might vote in a democracy or a republic where they elect representatives that will then vote for them. You might have a monarchy. And don't get too confused. A monarchy does not have to be passed down by lineage. It could be an elected monarchy. It could be a republican form of a monarchy where the monarch is elected. I know that was the theory of the way the Holy Roman Empire was supposed to work, and I believe it kind of worked that way. There are other periods of time where different countries probably elected their leaders as well too. I think the old Germanic cultures would elect who the next king would be, and then the people would swear an oath to him. Not necessarily all the people, but the important people, the oligarchy that really ruled the country. And they'd have this one figure they would call a king. And a king doesn't necessarily mean there's more power, and that doesn't need to be the title. You know, there's a lot of arguments. There's a great documentary on monarchy that I've seen on, I believe it's from the BBC, and you can really argue that the U.S. president is probably the most powerful monarch in the world, just because of the amount of power he possesses over the people of the country and over other countries with his ability to wage war. Now, this is not a judgmental thing saying that the U.S. is either corrupt or it's not corrupt, and that's not the point. The point is, monarchs make decisions that become law. And even in a country like the United States, where we have a legislative body that is supposed to do that, when they allow the president to use executive orders, or they, through legislation, empower the president or his employees in the executive branch to make decisions for them, to make up the regulations, to make up the rules. That's really, it's a fine line, and whether or not you want to even call it a monarchy or you want to call it a republic, it's up to you. It's indifferent. It's just, you need to know the form of government for the country that you're working in. How are the people taxed? You have to understand, the farther you're going to go back in time, the less money poor people have. Poor people, what we call the middle class today, they're going to pay a higher percentage of their income towards taxes than people who are rich. And it's just because, one, they have less income, and the government has its needs, and it's going to take it from everyone. It will find one way or another, whether it's a salt tax, to where you have to give salt to the king, and then the king will either use that as currency, or he will use it as ways of storing meat to prepare for war. There are days you have to work for your lord. I believe in medieval Europe they called these Lord's Days, and then you would have holidays on the other side where you did not have to serve. You would have a day of rest. It would be a feast or a festival. But on a Lord's Day, you work the fields specifically for him. All of the returns from those days belong to him so he could finance himself and, in theory, protect you from the bandits or invaders or whatever. And you have to understand, when you get into the legal discussion of that, because they protect you from bandits and lords does not mean they're going to get involved in the local judicial system. They don't care if peasants cheat or steal from each other unless it gets out of hand. They'll probably allow the peasants to do that themselves, much the same way we have a jury system now. The president doesn't get involved in every legal case, or your local representative does not get involved in every legal case. It's usually a jury of your peers, at least in the West. And I don't know enough about legal systems across the world to know how varied it is. It's also important to know what is the history of important events for that country. And when I've talked about history before, you have to understand I'm really only talking about up to the time you're going to tell the stories. Now, you might know history beyond the story, but for the purposes of why you need a country for world building, you really only need to know what's happened in a major sense up until the time that it started. And you'll probably know more the closer you get to that time frame, because there's more things that are still important. The importance of things in history fade over time. And I think I learned this in a history class during college, where a professor was talking about, was Reagan a great president? Was FDR a great president? Was JFK a great president? And he kind of went through all of these. And I thought, eloquently pointed out that you could never know because you have emotion tied up to them being in office. So if there is a person who's in office that you voted for, whether you like them or hate them, whether they are your Bush or your Obama or both, whether you like them or hate them, you'll never be a good judge of whether or not they were great, because you have emotions tied up in the moment. It's not until everyone's dead that you can start truly understanding the importance of an individual leader for a country. Now, you might feign importance, especially if you live in a highly dictatorial country where maybe they kill you if you don't do what they tell you to. You're probably more likely to say, "Yay, I love my leader," because you're afraid. But it's not a true statement. It's coerced. So it's something you might say, but whether or not you believe it, it's not important. And that just stresses the point of how coercive governments can be to make you think they are important. If they decide to shut down services because they're running low on money, what services do they choose to shut down? And they're probably going to make it painful to the people when they shut them down. What are important current events? So is there intrigue going on? Or is your country on the verge of a war or a civil war? Are big elections coming up if there are votes that happen? What are the current events that are really important to your world that could affect your story? Even if they're not part of the plot, they might propel the story for a bit to flesh out a story to make it more than a linear plot. And what are the relations that your country has with its neighbors? So the U.S. and Canada have fairly okay relations right now. Maybe not the best they've ever been, but we have a pretty good relationship with Canada. Canadians come and live in America all the time. I think you're probably more Americans going up and living in Canada than ever before. So there's a lot of people going back and forth. There's a lot of cultural ideas shifting back and forth. There's a lot of trade going back and forth. However, if you have East and West Germany back during the Cold War, they had very tense relationships. And a lot of it was because of the U.S. and Soviet influence over the half of Germany they controlled. But it doesn't matter. The point is that was a very strict, rigid border. You go to Korea, the South, the North Korean border, very dangerous border between other countries, sometimes on their own, have bad relations with their neighbors. And this is often a reason for war. In history, England and France, Germany and France, Spain and France, and England and Germany. There were wars going on all the time And a lot of it was really just the way that the tradition of like and dislike built up between the countries over time. You need to know the basic economics. What drives people's lives? Even in a totalitarian government where the government claims to control all of the economy, it's very doubtful they have the power to back that up. There are stories from the old Soviet Union where workers would go and they would build their quota of work as quickly as possible. So if I had to build 2 tons of nails a month to get my food from the government, I would make 20-inch iron spikes as heavy as possible. I'd make them so I could spend the minimum amount of time that I could actually making what I was required to survive. And then I might go out and work as a carpenter, or I might go deliver messages. I'd find some other way to help supplement my income to make my family's life or my life better. So you have to understand what drives the economy, and it might not always be money. The closer you get to subsistence, the less important money is, the more important goods are. So if I can supply you an elk, you might give me a home or land or something along those lines. So it's not going to always be about the coin or, the salt, the high-end goods. Sometimes it's just about, I need this, you have that. If it's a barter relationship, does money get involved? Does credit exist? Those things are all important. They might not be even exposed in your story outside of the way people are exchanging goods and services. But it's good to know. So if you go to the market and coins are important, what do you need to be able to get that turkey? Maybe I have cucumbers. So I take my cucumbers, and the turkey guy does not want cucumbers because he has so many cucumbers. So I go over to the carrot guy and I find carrots. I trade the carrots for cucumbers. And then I go over to the turkey guy because he wants carrots. I give him my carrots. So I'm trying to figure out a way to barter my goods to get the goods that I want. One thing you might ask, especially if you're doing earth-based fiction, is this important to me? I'm creating an urban fantasy story that takes place in New York City. Do I need to have a nation of my state worked out? Answer is yes. And the reason is, from the point your story begins, even if you want it very, very close to actual history of today, and you start it today, and you start with our current president, which is Obama, and you start with the people who are elected to Congress and to the Senate, and those are all the people involved in your story. Once your story of fiction begins, you're deviating from the real world. Are there consequences? What happens if major events happen in your story? Do governments fall? Does the government crack down? Maybe they decide that you're a terrorist and they start launching drones at you when you're on vacation somewhere overseas. It's hard to say, but the point is you want to start tracking your country. What are the rules of it? And that also leads into, who leads the country? How much influence do they have over the country itself? Maybe you believe the president in the U.S. has no power and he's just a corrupt puppet of foreign interest or corporations or whoever you don't like. And maybe or not it's true. It doesn't matter, but make up that rule for yourself so you know that this president has the authority that you think he does, or you only think he has authority, but there's really powers behind the scene, which are very common in fiction. Now, the question is, when do you stop creating countries? It all depends on how important they're going to be in your story. What I like to do, my rule of thumb, if I'm telling a story, is I want to know a lot of information about the country I'm telling the story in. If it's only in one country, that's the only country I really need fleshed out. However, if through the storytelling process, I end up telling more about like the leader of a different country, I make a note of who that leader is. That way it becomes consistent that at least that one day, he was the king of la 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 land. And later on, maybe I do a story in la 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 land, and it starts that day, and he's king, and there's a coup, and he's overthrown, and I get the story to a different place. Or maybe that is the story. That's okay, but it grounds it consistently, so if there's someone who's a fan of your stories, they don't get confused if they really pay attention. However, I do like to know the names of the neighboring countries, if they have good or bad relationship with the country I'm in, because, that becomes a thing. If you want to insult someone in England, you might call them a frog because that's what they call the French, and that was meant to be rude. I don't know the etymology of that. However, that's the way it used to be. And, the French would have insults for English, and all those countries we talked about in Europe having those wars, they all have little insults for the people in those countries. Now, if you have better relationships, you maybe still have semi-derogatory terms for each other. Who knows? There's a rivalry ship, especially the more nationalized the countries get. I think it maybe grows a little bit more to show that the U.S. is better than Canada or Mexico or vice versa. But those things are very, very important to know, are the relationships, because that gives you a way of interacting with people if they come from that culture, or how you can talk about people. Like the English had a lot of fear of the Northmen. So early on when the Northmen were raiding, and there was this huge fear of these ships that would come in off the mist and destroy your village and loot it and take your women, maybe it's the boogeyman. The Northmen are going to come for you if you're not a good kid and go to sleep. Now, you might ask yourself, how much of my country should I share? Is this good behind the scenes material? I think it is, but you might not think it is for your world. And if you don't think it is for your world, you don't have to share that. You don't have to share any of this outside of what shows up in stories. However, you want to know it so your stories stay consistent. However, if you decide to, there is a great resource I have to share. It is called the Gazetteer Writer's Manual, Creating Travel Guides to Fictional Worlds, part of the Worldbuilding series. And this book was written by two people who I have an immense amount of respect for. Deborah Tamaris Christian and Bruce Hurd, who are old school D&D world builders. I believe they both work in the Gazetteer series, which I still own some Gazetteers today. I still will flip through them today. They were really well done. And I got this book and went through this book very quickly. It's not a hard read, but it'll give you a lot of ideas of what to think about. And it'll also give you ideas of how to present it if you do want to present it. You could present it just strictly like an encyclopedia if you want to, or the whole idea of a Gazetteer is to make it like a travel manual. And then you can sort of have a little fun with it while you share it too, outside of your stories. Maybe you have a huge central authority, so you have this really fake, full of lies Gazetteer, but it backs up the government's line on the way the world is. Or vice versa, it's some guy in his basement who thinks the king is a jerk, and he has his own propaganda filled into it. So it doesn't always have to be completely real either. But the Gazetteer series, from the old Dungeons and Dragons stuff, they were wonderful books. Deborah, I know, has a wonderful website called the World Builders Academy. I've talked about it before, but it's worth checking out. Bruce Hurd has just released a new world, which is really cool, called the World of Caldera, which I believe is now available for sale. And like always, I'm going to put all of the things they talk about in the show notes. So if you go to the show notes on Garduel.com, you can just get them from there. If you sign up for my newsletter, I actually will send out a link to all of the show notes to your inbox once a week, just so you don't have to spend the time doing it. The rating for this episode is basic. You need to know where your story is being told. If you don't know that, even if it's the United States, even if it's all in Milwaukee or San Francisco or Indianapolis or Nashville, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to be consistent. You're going to confuse the people who interact with your stories, and they're not going to like it. And they're going to shut it and not come back to it. The world building task for the day. Go to an encyclopedia. Think of one country that you learned about in school and do some research on it. See the kinds of things they talk about. If it's ancient Persia or ancient China or Mesopotamia or the Incans, go look up the information that we talk about. These are the kinds of things that you're going to want to know about your world. Depending on how advanced your culture is, if you have a tribal culture that maybe they're stepbrothers like the Mongols, early on before Genghis Khan, you're probably not going to have information on architecture because they don't have any. But the thing is, look up in an encyclopedia. That's a good way to find out what you should know about your cultures and countries. The real world task for the day. Create a morning routine. Go into your Google Calendars or whatever calendar that you use. Sketch out how you want to get things done from the time you wake up until the time you go to work. When do you shower? When do you dress? Do you prepare your lunch and coffee at that time, or do you just have to push the button on the coffee maker? Create a routine. Do it the same way every day so you can get from your house to work with a minimal of thought. You're not wasting your thought on what clothes am I going to wear. You're not wasting your thought on, wait, do I have to make my coffee? Did I make my coffee? Because it's a routine. When it becomes a routine, you're not wasting thought on that. It helps store those tiny gray cells for the more important task of world building and I guess your job too, if you're like me and you're forced to work another job. The T's. Now, this will be my most controversial episode since my episode on religions. It will be talking about evolution. Now, I don't want people to get all caught up on that word. There's a reason I'm using it, and you'll learn more about it in the next episode. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.